Hey everybody, we are going to be starting chapter 23 here, the digestive system. This is going to be in 3 different parts, so I'm suggesting you look over parts 1 and 2 today, and then you can get to part 3 later. But part 1 here is going to talk about some just general concepts with the digestive system and basically get food down to our stomach. The functions of the digestive system may be a little bit obvious to you, of course, and that's okay. But we're going to talk about some very specific terminology that may not be so obvious. So, of course, the digestive system's job, it's to digest food, okay? And digestion comes in a couple of different forms, and we're going to talk about that here in this image. But there's another part to the digestive system. We not only have to break the food down that we're eating, but we've got to get the good stuff out of it. So we've got to absorb the nutrients. The nutrients that we're talking about here are things like vitamins and minerals and carbohydrates and proteins and fats and such. Okay, so if you look at the figure on the right here, the first part of digestion is ingestion. Of course, that's getting the food into the mouth. And in the mouth, breakdown begins, digestion begins. Now, digestion comes in 2 different forms. It's either a mechanical digestion or a mechanical breakdown, or it's a chemical digestion. So, mechanical digestion is literally something crushing the food and breaking it into smaller pieces. I think in the mouth, that sounds pretty obvious what is doing the crushing. So, that would be from your teeth, but also your tongue. But what I don't necessarily love about this figure is that it does not include the other type of breakdown in the mouth either. And like I said, the other type of breakdown is that chemical digestion. Chemical digestion is when you use enzymes to break down the food. And so I'm going to go through this as we move along, but there are enzymes in the mouth that begin chemical digestion. So don't let this figure mislead you. There is both mechanical and chemical digestion basically throughout the entire length of the digestive system, not just in the mouth, but also in the stomach and the small intestine, okay? It's just later on in the stomach and small intestine, the mechanical breakdown is just going to be from the muscle in the walls of those organs contracting and crushing the food. Either way, we propel our food, and we're going to talk about how we do that to get it going through the digestive system. And you can see that word digestion looks like it with what looks like a water droplet beside it. That is what they're indicating as chemical digestion, where you're going to be digesting with certain enzymes, and we'll refer to the enzymes as we move along. And so that will happen in the stomach and the small intestine, which we're going to go through all of these pieces separately. Once you get down to the small intestine, then you start talking about absorption. So that is getting the good stuff, getting the nutrients out of the digestive system so we can supply it to the rest of the body. And then, of course, the large intestine's job is some absorption. We'll talk about that later, but also to create, you guessed it, poop. All right? It's a dirty job, but something's got to do it, right? Now listen, if I was standing in front of you, I'd make a much bigger deal about saying the word poop. All right? My whole life, with little kids, there's a lot of poop involved. Anyways, we all do it, so why not talk about it, right? So the poop or the feces, that's the stuff that is left over from our food that we really can't use. So we got to get it out. The process of getting it out is going to be defecation. That is a reflex, and luckily we get to talk about that. But we'll have to save that for part 3. All right. The digestive system can be broken down into 2 different categories and the organs involved. The first set of organs we're going to see, and we'll see these on the next slide, and I'll refer back to the categories, these categories. The first is the alimentary canal. This is what you might hear referred to as your gastrointestinal tract, your GI tract, or just simply your gut. So what this is, it is a tube, and it is lined with lots of different tissues. We'll cover that here in just a minute, but it definitely, in the walls of every single structure within this tube, is muscle. All right, and this is basically, the alimentary canal is one single tube that starts with your mouth and ends at your anus. All right, and it goes straight through your body. There are, of course, some curves and twists and turns and all that good stuff, but it is the path from start to stop. And this is where those digestive processes happen. And what I mean by digestive processes is going to be digestion, that mechanical and chemical breakdown, but also absorption. Now, along the way, you are going to meet up and come into contact with other organs. And these are called accessory organs because the food doesn't technically pass through them, but they are connected to the tube. They're connected to the alimentary canal. And what they do is provide digestive support through secretions. We're going to talk about what I mean exactly, what that means for each organ as we get to it. That'll be in part 2, I believe. But those digestive secretions are going to help with the digestive processes. Most of the time, we're talking about enzymes that are going to help with the chemical breakdown of our food. So let's look at all of the organs that are within the digestive system, and let's categorize them in terms of the alimentary canal or the accessory organs. So let's start with the alimentary canal. Remember, this is a tube from start to stop. So we're going to start with the mouth, and so the mouth would be the first organ of the alimentary canal if you want to think about the oral cavity kind of as an organ. And then you're going to move along. We're going to come back to everything else that you see. We're just going to focus on the alimentary canal first. You move down into the throat. Remember, the fancy word for throat is the pharynx. If you remember back to our discussions in the respiratory system, remember that at least a part of the pharynx is shared between the digestive and the respiratory system. But this part of the pharynx is going to not sort of branch off into the larynx. It's going to continue and become the esophagus. So that's the next organ in the alimentary canal. The esophagus, you see it kind of behind the liver there. The esophagus then becomes the stomach. Okay, it kind of looks like a J. And then at the bottom of the stomach, you have the small intestine. And the small intestine has 3 different sections to it: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. Sometimes you see those second 2 parts brought into one group. So you would call that the jejunoileum and just combine those last 2 sections. But I'll refer back to these sections when we get to the small intestine because the duodenum has a slightly different job than the jejunum and the ileum, and we'll come back to that. But nonetheless, this is just a really scrunched up, really long tube, the small intestine. And at the end of the small intestine, and there's no way to trace even in this picture. But if you look at this person, that person's bottom right corner, or on the slide, if you're looking sort of at the slide, it would be on the bottom left-hand slide, you then see the small intestine become the large intestine. And the first part of the large intestine is going to be the appendix, and that's that little kind of finger that's sticking out. All right, and then you see the cecum, which is a really short part of the large intestine, the very beginning. And then what you see is a couple of different parts of the colon. So the colon is technically the second section of the large intestine. And you have the ascending colon, which goes from the cecum straight up towards the liver. And then you see the transverse colon, which is going straight across the body. Looks like the top of a T, transverse T. Okay, that's kind of how you can remember that. And then the large intestine, that next part of the colon goes straight down. So that's the descending colon. If you follow that descending colon, which we're getting close to the end at this point, there is a curved part of the colon, which we call the sigmoid colon. And then lastly, the large intestine, the third section of it becomes the rectum, and then it moves right before the exit point, which is the anus. That very short section there is called the anal canal. So from start to stop, those are all the organs of the alimentary canal. But we have accessory organs, okay? Anything with a star on this image is an accessory organ, all right? Most of them, with little exception, maybe the tongue, and maybe technically the gallbladder, which we'll come back to, but these accessory digestive organs are mostly going to secrete some kind of fluid, some kind of digestive enzyme, which is going to help with the digestive process. Now, they secrete these things and they squirt them basically into the alimentary canal, because that's where the digestion happens. But the food doesn't actually pass through these accessory organs, okay? So, obviously the tongue doesn't squirt or make anything, so there are some exceptions, but certainly the salivary glands, the liver, the pancreas, and to an extent the gallbladder is going to make and or secrete digestive fluids, okay? And as we get to those accessory organs, we'll talk about the salivary glands first, but we're going to talk about the specific contributions of each accessory organ as we move along. I mentioned earlier that the alimentary canal, it's just one long tube, but its walls are made up, at least in part, by smooth muscle. So the wall of that alimentary canal really is made up of 4 different layers. And within each organ, these layers may look a little bit different, maybe a little bit thicker or a little bit thinner in one organ versus another, but all of the organs of the alimentary canal have these base 4 layers in their wall. So we're going to start with the innermost layer, which is right beside the lumen, the inner part of the tube, and then we're going to work our way out and talk about the 4 different layers of the alimentary canal, what they're made of, and what their functions are. So first we've got the mucosa. So this is really just a single layer of columnar epithelial cells. And these columnar cells are going to secrete things, and a lot of those secretions are going to be really important for digestion. So some of the secretions could be like a watery mucus. Okay, we'll kind of talk about the role of that a little bit later. It could be enzymes. Again, those are used to directly break down the food and have that chemical digestion. Or some of the secretions might be hormones. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about some hormones as we go along, but the hormones are going to help regulate the secretions. The epithelial cells of the mucosa also are going to do absorption. So there are certain cells within the tube that would secrete things, and then other cells necessary for the absorption part. And so that's to get the nutrients out of the canal, the alimentary canal, and into the body. And then, if you guys remember, back in chapter 20, we talked about MALT, the mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. So these are going to be areas of lymphoid tissue located throughout the alimentary canal. And remember that that is to help protect us. That's to serve as a site for our body to come into contact with pathogens and start fighting that off and activating the adaptive immune system and making those memory cells. All that stuff that we talked about back in chapters 20 and 21.
Welcome to the Alexa Prize.
Oh gosh, guys, this is so much fun. So I'm sitting in my basement, of course, and frickin' Alexa just starts talking. Alexa, stop.
Sorry, I'm having problems with your request. Please try again later.
Oh my gosh.
If you have issues, please contact support.
Jeez Louise, guys. The struggle is real. Okay, sorry about that. It's not worth re-recording, I promise you. It's so clunky, it's not worth re-recording. So you guys get to endure. All right, anyways. The next part, the next layer of the wall is the submucosa. Okay, so we've started inside and we're moving our way out. The submucosa is just a connective tissue, sort of a loose connective areolar tissue. It's made up of a lot of elastin, but it also has a very rich supply of blood. And of course, that blood is going to be delivering good nutrients to the actual cells of the wall so they can stay alive, but also taking away sort of cellular respiration waste products. We also have a very rich nervous supply because we have to control all of the digestive processes. So we do that through the nervous system. And also there's a very rich supply of the lymphatic system. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this when we get to the small intestine, when we talk about absorption, but we need all of these different things in order to absorb the nutrients. All right, so from the submucosa, we're going to move out one more layer to the muscularis externa, which is at least 2 different layers of smooth muscle. And in some organs like the stomach, there's actually a 3rd layer of smooth muscle. So these layers of smooth muscle are going to be found one on top of the other, but the fibers of the smooth muscle run in different directions. Okay, so let's see if we can talk about these different fibers. And because they run in different directions, they help with our digestive processes in different ways. The first layer is the longitudinal muscle. Longitudinal muscle, the fibers of that muscle runs the length of the alimentary canal. Okay, so sort of up and down with the walls of the tube. The longitudinal muscles are most responsible for the process of peristalsis. Okay, peristalsis is going to propel food forward through the alimentary canal. All right, and you see these sort of wave-like contractions of the smooth muscle, and that helps squeeze the food and sort of push it forward, and it's sort of squeezing it from behind. just like you would take a tube of toothpaste. And when it's starting to get really low, then you go to the very end of the tube and you just sort of squeeze it forward towards the opening to try to get as much of that toothpaste out. So that would be a peristaltic wave. Now there's another layer of smooth muscle, and that's called the circular muscle. And the circular muscle, the fibers of the circular muscle are going to run around the circumference of the alimentary canal. All right. So it's like if you took that tube and wrapped your hand around it, then and squeezed, that would be circular muscle. All right, and so that provides a different type of digestive assistance, and that's called segmentation. Segmentation is going to be useful for mixing of the food. Okay, so like, you swallow one bite, but then you swallow the next bite, and during segmentation, those two bites of food that were sort of separate entities actually ultimately get mixed together. And that's what that image is trying to show you on the right there, 23.3b. You've got these different groups of food, and they're represented by different colors. And so segmentation, using that circular muscle, is going to sort of split the chunks of food in half, and split them in half again, and by doing that they mix up the different groups of food. Okay, so the way I like to think about this is, let's just say you had, and maybe I can think of a better example later, but this is what I've got right now in my head. Let's say you take a whole bunch of rice and you fill up like a tube sock with rice. All right, and you clamp the bottom and you clamp the top so the rice isn't going to come spilling out. Now, the segmentation, the mixing with the circular muscle, that's going to be like if you took your hands and in one place on that sock just squeezed that rice. You're going to kind of push whatever rice was underneath your hand, you're going to push some of it down, you're going to push some of it up, all right? But you're basically squeezing where that rice is. Now let's say you take your other hand just underneath and you let go with the first hand and you squeeze with the other hand. All right, so now you've pushed some rice back up, you've pushed more rice down. So let's say you grab it again and squeeze it again, and it's just like you squeezing this tube sock back and forth, and the rice is moving up and down, up and down, up and down. And in doing that movement, it would be mixing the particles of the rice around. All right. And this is used as a mechanical form of breakdown because you're physically breaking the food into smaller chunks and mixing it up. All right. Peristalsis with that longitudinal muscle would be if you unclamped one end of your tube sock and then went from the top and just like squeezed and then pushed all the rice out of the end. That would be your peristaltic wave with your longitudinal muscle. Okay, so right outside the muscle on the very outermost layer of the alimentary canal is a layer of tissue called the serosa. It's got a couple of different layers of cells. It does have some areolar connective tissue, but it's also got some epithelial cells in it as well. And this is really just for protection of the muscle and the other layers underneath, but also to anchor the digestive organs to other structures. This figure in your book, 23.5, shows you all of those different layers of the alimentary canal, just like we just talked about. Starting from the very middle space, which is the lumen, of course, that's where the food would be. The next layer out is called the mucosa, and if you kind of look, there's various glands, and those various glands would be producing the secretions, the enzymes, the hormones, what have you. You can also see the malt in there. Move out one layer, and that's going to be the submucosa. And the submucosa, as you see, if you follow it around, you can see red, blue, and green tubes, and also yellow tubes. So those are representing blood supply, arterial and venous. That's representing lymphatic system, which are the green tubes, and then the yellow ones are representing the nervous system supply. You move out one more layer, then you can see the 2 layers of muscle, the longitudinal layer and also the circular layer of muscle. And you can here see that the fibers of those muscles run in perpendicular directions to each other. Now, if I can remember my math, geometry, I don't remember. Guys, I'm only having to teach kindergarten math during this homeschooling part. Or shouldn't I say homeschool? Online instruction. I can handle kindergarten math. 5 minus 3. Let's count to 100. Got it. Anything much past that, it's not my bag. But anyways, the layers of the muscle run sort of perpendicular to one another. Of course, remember that the direction of those layers of muscle cells indicates something about how they contract and the function of that contraction, whether it be sort of a segmentation mixing versus a peristaltic longitudinal type of contraction. And then on the very outside, you see the serosa, and that's your connective layer. If you look in the very bottom left-hand corner, you see this label called mesentery. The mesentery is actually what the serosa is called when it attaches to neighboring structures. All right, and a lot of times that serosa will sort of fold back onto itself and as it is going to connect to other neighboring structures. But anyways, that is all for protection of the underlying organs. From here on out, we're going to start with the beginning of the alimentary canal and work our way through. About halfway through, we're just going to take a little bit of a detour and go over the accessory organs, but mostly what we're going to do, start from the beginning and just work our way to the end. All right? So first off, we've got the mouth, also known as the oral cavity. All these things that I've listed on this slide, I don't really feel like I need to point them out to you. They're already labeled on this image, but they are important for you to know. So I've given you all this list of structures that you do need to know. All right. Now, a lot of the structures in the mouth are necessary for that mechanical digestion. So for example, the teeth, of course, are going to be used to crush our food, but our tongue is used to crush our food as well. And that can press the food up against the roof of the mouth, which is made up of the hard and soft palates, and that can help crush our food as well. But the other thing that is necessary in the mouth is to produce what we call a bolus of food. Okay, I think it's written on the next slide. Oh no, 2 slides from now. Bolus, B-O-L-U-S. That's what we call the glob of food that you swallow. Okay, so the whole reason that you're chewing your food and that you're using your tongue, crushing it up against, your cheeks, the inside of your cheeks, and your hard and soft palate, is to produce this bolus. The other structures that are important for producing this bolus are the salivary glands, and they are going to help with this bolus by producing saliva. So we're going to talk more about saliva here in just a minute. This is another view of the oral cavity, but specifically focusing on the salivary glands and where they're located. Okay, we've got a number of different salivary glands. The most prominent one is going to be that parotid gland, which you can see right to the left of the ear of this person. Parotid gland, you've got some glands up underneath the tongue, the sublingual gland and that kind of thing, submandibular. But what I want to point out are those green lines that are coming from the salivary glands. These are the salivary ducts, okay? And the salivary glands are producing the saliva, which we're going to talk about next, and they are distributing the saliva into the oral cavity through these ducts. And those ducts are going to enter into that oral cavity through small holes. All right? And that's how the saliva is going to get into the mouth. So here is everything you ever wanted to know about spit, and probably a little bit more. All right? Spit just, I don't know, seems like spit. But spit, or I guess I should stop calling it spit, I can call it saliva. Saliva has a lot of stuff going on, okay? So what I've done on this slide is taken the main functions of saliva and equated those functions to the various components that are found in saliva. All right, so first off, like I mentioned before, we have to form a bolus, and of course that is what we swallow, the chunk of food that we swallow. We know that it has to be a certain size, it has to be a certain shape, it has to be a certain consistency. So saliva is going to help form that bolus and lubricate it so it's not so hard. And that is mostly done through the base of saliva, which is water. That's mostly what it is. Okay, that's why when you're very dehydrated, you get a super dry mouth because, water is the biggest component of saliva, so that's one of the first things that kind of goes if you are dehydrated. But the other thing is there is some mucus that is composing saliva, and that's going to help with this function as well. And the last thing I have here is facilitate taste. You guys remember talking back in chapter 15, I believe it is, which is your special senses chapter. In order for these chemicals in your food to bind to the taste buds, they have to be dissolved in fluid. So, of course, saliva is going to help us with our ability to taste food. But there is another really important component of saliva that's going to help us actually digest our food, and these are different enzymes. And since these are enzymes helping to digest our food, this is going to be the start of chemical digestion. Now, we have an enzyme called amylase. And amylase is an enzyme that helps us break down starches, which is kind of like a large carbohydrate. And amylase is produced in another location in the digestive system, which we will come back to. So in order for us to know that this particular enzyme is made from the salivary glands, we call it salivary amylase. There is also another enzyme that is found in saliva, and that is salivary lipase. Lipase helps us break down fat. So we begin the chemical digestion of certainly carbohydrates and fat in the mouth. Okay, so another function of saliva is protective. Okay, so we keep saliva at a slightly acidic pH. There is digestive proteins, immune proteins, excuse me, that are found in saliva, and these are all trying to kill any kind of pathogen that may be getting in to our body through what we're eating. Lastly, saliva does kind of have a protective function to it. Electrolytes, those electrolytes, they're also contributing to the acidity of the pH, but electrolytes are going to be things like sodium and potassium, yes, but we can also lump in things like calcium and phosphorus into electrolytes. And having calcium and phosphorus in our mouth helps contribute to the health of our teeth. Okay, so the food has been chewed up in our mouth and a bolus has been made. Okay, just a clump or a glob of food, and it is ready to be swallowed. And so the process of swallowing is known as deglutition. That's the fancy word for it, deglutition. And that swallowing process is going to occur while we push the food out of our mouth, through our pharynx, and down our esophagus. So in the esophagus and the pharynx also, there's no digestion, there's no absorption. So there's really no processes of digestion that are happening, that are really of any consequence. It's literally just a tube to get food from the mouth to the stomach. So the process of deglutition is a reflex, and mostly it's involuntary, and we're going to see that on the next slide, how that happens. The initiation, the stimulus of this reflex is voluntary because you physically take your tongue and you push that bolus of food backwards towards the back of your mouth. And once the food gets to the back of the pharynx, that stimulates the reflex. Okay, so this is the same reflex that we've talked about, the same sort of reflexive pathway where you've got a stimulus and then, you've got sort of an integrating center and efferent neurons, all that good stuff, okay? But this reflex is mediated through the medulla, which is at the very base of the brain stem. During this time, during this reflex, during deglutition, all the respiratory passages are blocked, and I'll show you that on the next slide, to make sure that the food gets into the esophagus, and so it doesn't get into the trachea. And then once it gets into the esophagus, once the food gets there, then peristaltic waves are going to push it down all the way to the stomach. So on the next slide, we're going to see some pictures, so let's look more at this reflex. The process of deglutition here, again, fancy word for swallowing, starts, like I mentioned before, when that bolus of food, which is shown in green here, is pushed to the back of the mouth through the tongue, okay? And so that pushes the food into the oropharynx, okay? So if that name doesn't sound familiar, go back to the respiratory system chapter where we named the different parts of the pharynx. But the next thing that's going to happen is that the respiratory passages are blocked. So one respiratory passage would be up the pharynx into the nose, because remember, the pharynx has a passageway between those two places. So the uvula is going to flop up and block off the nasopharynx. Remember, the uvula is the hanging ball. Remember? I told you guys about the hanging ball. Apparently, not everyone calls it the hanging ball. I'm okay with that. If you need a reminder, if you go back a couple of slides to where the Gene Simmons open mouth was, that shows you where the uvula / hanging ball is. It has a job, and its job is to block the nose so food doesn't hop up there. The other respiratory passage that's going to be blocked is to the trachea. Remember our epiglottis. Okay, so if you look at the mouth and the throat in step 1, you can see the epiglottis is flipped upward. Okay, it's literally pointing up towards the mouth. But if you look at the face in step 2, look at that epiglottis. It has literally flopped downward. And what it is doing at this point is it is covering the entrance into the larynx, which ultimately heads down to the lungs. Okay, so that epiglottis is going to pop down, cover that entrance to make sure the food bolus is going to head into the esophagus, which is step number 3. All right. Now, there are structures that we call sphincters, and these sphincters, we talked a little bit about sphincters when we talked about the precapillary sphincters, but we're going to see a lot more sphincters in the digestive system. They're just little rings of smooth muscle, and they help, when they contract, they help to close off passages. So this is the upper esophageal sphincter, and it closes after the bolus of food passes through there into the esophagus. It's like at the entrance to the esophagus, and that makes sure that the bolus of food can only go in one direction, and that is down, not back up into the pharynx. If you look down at step 4, the next step here in this reflex is peristalsis. Let's get this food down the esophagus as efficiently as possible. We're going to squeeze that toothpaste from the bottom of the tube all the way down. All right. Now, along the way, you do have your circular muscles that are contracting, again, to sort of prevent the bolus from going backwards, to kind of help those peristaltic waves. But it's mostly through those longitudinal muscles. And then step number 5, once that bolus gets to the entrance of the stomach, that is another sphincter called the gastroesophageal sphincter. And the bolus of food and the muscles are going to literally squeeze that bolus into the stomach. So here's where we're going to stop for part 1. At this point, we're kind of tracking some food, a bolus of food. We've chewed it up. We've gotten it all good and salivated, and we have swallowed that chunk of food, that bolus, and it has now reached the stomach. So that's where we're going to pick up in part 2.